Good to see everybody. Glad you're here to close out AAPI month. And Curtis Chin here, filmmaker, is going to join us for the conversation. And you know Virgo Lee, a special advisor to the estate, and you just heard Professor Ngai. Maybe I'll start with Virgo first, if I may. You're a special advisor to the estate. How did you meet Corky Lee?
Well, way back in 1969, I was a student at Columbia University, the School of Engineering. And at that time, at Columbia, there was a lot of student protests against the Vietnam War. And I became involved with a group of students, Asian American students, who became activists, radical, anti-war group. And we expanded and decided after about a couple of years of doing student organizing on campus, we decided it was time that we took our experience and went to the Chinese community and did the same type of community organizing. And in 1970, we opened up a storefront in Manhattan's Chinatown, and that's actually when I met Corky. Corky was a housing advocate for a nonprofit called Two Bridges Neighborhood Council. And we, the radical student organizers, like Obama was a community organizer, and we decided, well, we need to do something. And at that time, all of the tenement buildings on the eastern edge of Chinatown were being bought up by the predecessor company to Verizon called New York Telephone. So they were buying up all the tenement buildings, and they were going to smash them all down and build a huge switching station. So Corky came over because he saw that we had opened up a storefront and said, hey, we need to do something about this because all of the affordable apartments are being boarded up, and there's no place for people to live. And so we said, sure, let's do something. So within a matter of 48 hours, we, organized a group of young people, got a bunch, got some tools, crowbars, hammers, whatever you want to call it. And we went from building to building, and we started tearing down all the boarded up windows and prying open the doors to the apartments. And Corky was one of the lead organizers of that movement, and we called it the We Won't Move Committee. And it's documented, it's well documented, because we had a handwritten bilingual newspaper that we had published called Getting Together. And on the third issue, there's a picture of Corky on a ladder tearing down the tin plate cover to the windows. So that's how I met Corky.
So let me just stop you there, because
yeah.
I want to take some of those themes out that, you and Corky were student radical activists. And, sometimes, particularly in this generation of Asian American activists, tend to forget that existed for different historical reasons. But I just wanted to note that, because in that period, in 1968-69, is when the term Asian American was invented at a student protest in Northern California, at protests out of San Francisco State University and Berkeley. And it was a movement nationwide, and also in New York. And it was really sort of frothed up by the civil rights movement, by the Black Power movement, and the Vietnam War, which kind of radicalized many Asians. Well, they were Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. Those were the three large groups. And they had been sort of in their silos, worked a little bit, didn't really work together. But that period, that politically and socially, fermentive time, created two student organizers, Yuji Yujioka and Emma G., who were graduate students, created the Asian American Coalition, or Asian American Student Union. And that was the first use of the term Asian American. That's where it really was invented. And it just kind of exploded across the country of Asian students that were connected, mostly in San Francisco, New York, Seattle. And so I just want to sort of just locate that. And he documented, because he was a college student, or he just graduated?
He had just graduated.
He had just graduated.
Queens.
Right, Queens College, also a history major. He had grown up in Queens, not in Chinatown, but grown up in Queens, but spent his life documenting Chinatown. But I just wanted to maybe turn to Curtis. Curtis and I are a little bit after that generation, but Curtis, just to place it in context, because I'm going to bring it to us right now, because where we are right now, for us sitting right here, the Asian American movement has reached another signal moment that's very important, and we need to know sort of where it comes in, how it gets placed. But Curtis, who was a co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop, graduated college in the 90s, like myself. Tell us a little bit about the work you did and about Corky.
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting this Asia Society, Albany, and the Corky Lee Estate. It's always a pleasure to talk, about our friend and to remember all the great work that he did. In terms of your question was about talk about Corky's work or my work? I wasn't quite sure about that.
Well, you can talk about the work you did with Corky, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the film.
Okay. Well, in terms of how I met Corky, I had moved to New York City right after graduating from the University of Michigan, and my first job was working as an intern at the Chinatown History Project, is what it was called back then. And Corky would always pop in and just sort of sniff around, see what was going on. And he was just this really, really nice guy. And he was just curious, well, who are you? Why are you here? And so we just struck up this, casual friendship. And when I eventually went off, as you mentioned, to start this group called the Asian American Writers Workshop, we instantly knew that we had to invite Corky to our events because if Corky wasn't at the event, then it wasn't a real event, right? It didn't happen. And so he was really great about covering all the original events at the Writers' Workshop. And so we just maintained this pretty casual friendship. I'd see him everywhere because we both stayed in the community, whether it was in New York City or at a conference in Los Angeles or in Utah or in Houston. He was just everywhere. And so when it came to make this film called Our Chinatown that I wanted to make a few years ago, looking at the gentrification and some of the other issues facing other Chinatowns in the United States, because I grew up in one that had disappeared, the one in Detroit, and I started to wonder if the other Chinatowns around the U.S. would be disappearing. I instantly knew that Corky was one of those voices that was critical to have in the film, and so our team started filming him as part of that film, but we were about 80% done with shooting, and then COVID hits, and we're like, okay, well, we don't know what to do with this footage. We're just going to sit, and hopefully in a couple months, we'll all be able to go film again, and we can finish the film and get it out there. But sadly, 2 months went to 3 months, went to 4 months, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, the conversation had changed because of the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and George Floyd. Some of the issues that we were covering in the film, like gentrification and overcrowdedness, and just didn't seem to be as pressing, as hate crimes. And then sadly, when Corky passed away, we just felt like, my God, the devastating loss, but then also feeling like that we were in this possession of this wonderful footage where Corky had a chance to really speak for himself, because all through the filming, all the time that we spent with him for that year and a half, off and on filming him, he really, really wanted to talk about his legacy. And I think that he just really, as Mae referred a little bit earlier, in terms of just feeling like maybe he didn't get as much notice as he might have wanted. He really, really wanted people to know that he had this wonderful collection of photographs and that he had all this stuff. And so we just felt like, we had to put together this new film for him, despite the fact that, my teammate, Ken Eng, we both moved on to other projects. We just felt like we had to prioritize this and come back to this film and get it out there. And so we feel so lucky or fortunate to have been in this position of being able to spend that much time with Corky and to really get to know him and to allow him to share his story with us. And now for us to be able to share the story with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Curtis. Just a few thoughts before I turn to Professor Ngai was that I love when you talked about Bill Cunningham, famous fashion photographer for the New York Times. You became sort of a little bit more famous after a documentary was made about him. And I saw him once on the streets of New York, and I was like, there's Bill Cunningham. Yeah. And I went up to him and I said, can I take a picture with you? And he said, I'm working. And he just kind of shooed me away. And, you know, I had a different relationship with Corky. It was hard to overstate how he seemed omnipresent and around forever. Like, because he had been there really from the beginning. And he had shot all 5 decades and had a certain amount of, everyone within the Asian American community knew who he was. They knew how important he was. They loved him. But we know that people outside of it didn't quite appreciate that. And often it is for artists, only after they pass, unfortunately, is their legacy known, you know, beyond their immediate circles. But before we get there, maybe you can go back to his origin story, Professor Ngai, if you can maybe tell his origin story, how he's often told his origin story, and how he got to do this work, why his passion fueled this work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Corky. Well, I just want to say, so I have my cred that I was there too in 1970. I didn't break down the building windows, but Virgo tells me I was at the demonstrations against the tour buses in Chinatown, and which seems like, why would we do that? But at the time, we thought that they were very corrupt. These tourism companies were getting, you know, kind of payola from certain restaurants, and they would steer people to them. So Virgo reminded me of that. But anyway, and I kind of circled back to, then I became an academic and I moved away from Chinatown, but I came back to Corky in November of 2019 because I had become the director of our ethnic studies program at Columbia, and I invited him to come up and host a show in our gallery. We had a small gallery, and he came up and he measured the walls, and he was like, well, I could do this theme, but I could do that theme. I could do this theme. So he hadn't really decided what he was going to do. But that was at the end of 2019. And then a few months later, everything shut down, and we never were able to mount the show. But working on this book, I learned a lot about Corky that not everybody perhaps knows, you know. So, first of all, I just want to say that the amount of commitment it took for him to go to 2 and 3 events a day, week in and week out, year in and year out, for 50 years, to document what was going on in our communities.
Unpaid.
Mostly unpaid. And it was, to say it was a labor of love is to really underestimate his passion and his commitment. And his commitment was about breaking stereotypes, right? To photograph not only protests, rallies and marches, but also people in their ordinary social environment. Like, we're real people, right? We're not cartoon characters. And so how did he get all those photos? Because there was no internet, right? Back in the 70s and even the 80s, you couldn't get a notice from Ebony or some group that's going to be this. How did he know where to go for these photos? So Corky's day job was at a print shop in Chelsea called Expedia. And Expedia was owned by a Chinese entrepreneur who was very progressive. And Corky was the account executive. So he dealt with everybody who, you know, and we all know Corky, how garrulous he is. He made friends with everybody who came in. And there were, you know, minority newspapers, progressive organizations. They printed their monthly or weekly newspapers there, or posters for their events. So he had the inside info as to what was coming up, and then he was able to go to all of these events. And then later, of course, obviously with the internet and email and things like that. But a lot of his photographs of events and rallies, especially those that were not in Chinatown, those in the Japanese American community or Filipinos, you know, in Jersey City, a lot of this went through this print shop. And Ai Weiwei was a worker in this print shop. He was a production. this guy, Sam Chen, hired a lot of Chinese foreign students as production workers.
Sounds like a heck of a sitcom. It's like, it'll be interesting.
And so, they did all the stripping work. It was, kind of hard manual labor.
It was Facebook in the printing press before,
exactly,
Facebook. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, so we have a little piece by Ai Weiwei that he contributed to the book, and there's that famous photo that Curtis has in the film of Ai Weiwei at the Tiananmen. And when we showed it to Ai Weiwei, he said, I have only a dim recollection of that event. And he's not the only person who's told us when we showed them photos of them at an event who said, oh, I don't really remember that, but yes, now I do. And Corky was there to record not only the history of the community and the history of the movement, but also people's personal histories and personal involvement in those histories. So
he knew he would have to remind the people themselves that they were there.
Yeah. So he once said he took about 200 photos a week. So over 50 years, that is 500,000, give or take, photographs. So how do we select the photos for the book, right? Out of 500,000, and it's not like so. What we did, we started with, because Corky actually always wanted to have a book of his own photos. Most people who know him know that he dreamed of having his own book. And he had started to prepare a book in 2011 with Chi Wang-ing, who's my co-editor on the book. And they created a mock-up, and they chose 100 photographs. So we started with that, those 100 photos taken from 1970 to 2011, because those are the photos that Corky selected for his own book, right? So we wanted to start with what he thought was most significant. And then for the next 10 years, we added photos that he took, that he loaned to groups, that he took of events, that he, that he also selected and gave to people, like gave to Curtis for his film, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the base of the film, and then we dug into the archives, which will blow your mind when you see the book. You're going to have to wait for that.
In the documentary, Corky's very emotional, but he wasn't like that, I think, every day. He was actually very, at least in my experience with him, and I have a different experience, he was very restrained.
Yes.
But I think that once you peeled and got to a point with him where his passion came out, and that's really what fueled 5 decades of work, mostly unpaid and unheralded. That passion, once I heard that, it made sense. It surprised me. Virgo, did you want to talk a little bit more about that? Yeah. About his passion?
Well, at the very beginning, Corky didn't even have a camera. He ended up borrowing a friend's camera, and then he started practicing by taking photos of the community activities or protests that we were engaged in. So you'll see that in the very early years, let's say from 1969 to 1970, 71, there's not a whole lot of photographs. But by the time we get to 1972, he had decided he wanted to become a photojournalist. How do I know that? In 1972, the Chinese mission to the United Nations organized what they called the Asian American Youth Travel Delegation, the first group from the United States to go to China after Nixon opened up relations by having that impromptu meeting with Mao. And that started the whole process of China entering the United Nations. So the Chinese mission formed a group of basically student activists across the country. Corky ended up being selected as part of that group. I was on that group. And he brought 40 rolls of film, slide films, for that trip. So in the archives that Professor Ngai is referring to is this wonderful collection of photographs from that trip. China right after the Cultural Revolution, when it was a poor rural country, being visited by strange-looking young Asian American people
long hair
from the United States. It was Some of the photos, you're going to see in the book, it will blow your mind. I'll just quickly raise a couple of things. The things that Corky was able to record, like right now the big issues in the United States are the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. All of that stuff, we had the equivalent for that in that early period. We preached in our, collective radical group, which is called Iwokyun. Some of you may know or have heard of that. We preached Third World Unity, which basically meant make alliances with Black and Latino groups, community groups. And at that time, it was unheard of. We invited people from the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords Party, to come to community activities in Chinatown. People were freaking out. They said, why are you inviting blacks to come to Chinatown for Asian activities? You must be out of your mind. We have problems with them. So we said, no. I said, this is a much bigger issue. This is about, minorities uniting and showing the broader society that we can work together. So we did stuff like that. Corky was there. He recorded it. It's in the book, and it will blow your mind. The Me Too movement. At that time, we were, amongst progressive people, we were engaged in fighting male chauvinism. Okay, that was the big catchphrase at that time. And there was a lot of struggle within the progressive groups about fighting male chauvinism, giving women equal power and equal voice in decision-making. So all of these issues are rolled up into that first decade, and it's an experience that a lot younger, Asian Americans today are not aware of, but it's part of AAPI history, starting from that point, and by happenstance, people like myself was there, and we bear witness to exactly what happened. And it will be shown in the book, and I think it will open up a lot of eyes.
Yeah. And just a few technical points for those of you that have never operated a film camera. In that era, a film camera was something that a college student, unless they were a photography major, would not own. It was something that a professional with some amount of money would buy. And, you would have a roll of 24, a roll of 36, and you would count each one. 1, 2. Anybody walking? No. Because that it was something, right? So just to give a sense of, in the first decade at least, they had to get a dark room, they had to develop. These were very expensive sunk costs, even in the 70s, that people were like, well, we're not going to waste it on this. Only famous people and things like that. As part of the social revolution, he was pointing the camera at the restaurant worker having a cigarette break, right? So that's the sort of radical nature of that. And I think that, once again, Virgo, thank you very much for talking about that trip to China, talking about the Vietnam War, which radicalized Asians in America at that time. Muhammad Ali was part of that. He goes, why are you going to send me to Vietnam? Because they never called me the N-word, right? And the Asians were like, whoa, you just spoke to me. And it kind of it was this time, so we have to, because we didn't live, for those of us that didn't live then, we need to remember that that was a political awakening, a radicalization. That was putting groups together. And that's important to remember because the geopolitical relationship then affected domestic political and cultural awakenings, and it does now too. And we need to draw that line that, sometimes we tend to just look Asian American, and it is, but also the larger relationship between U.S. and Asia, U.S. and China, U.S. and Japan, through different periods in history, really have that effect. I don't know if Curtis...
Can I circle back and ask Curtis a question?
Yes, please.
I think one of the things that's so powerful about Dear Corky is how you shadow him, right? You follow him as he's taking pictures, as he's making coffee, as he's talking to you. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of your take on Corky as a person. Because my impression of him is that he's very garrulous, but he's also very private. And I think being behind the camera was a kind of safe place for him in some ways. But I'd love to hear, you spent, I don't know how long with him, following him, filming him, listening to him, recording him. And I don't know, and that's later in his life, right? This, that was in the 2010s, right, when you were filming?
the
late tens. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, your book sounds incredible, amazing. I can't wait to see those photos of the early 70s and some of that coalition work. So, yeah. When does that book come out again? I got to pre-order my copy.
February 27th.
In terms of Corky, I mean, I think that, you guys probably know him better than we did. So it's weird for me to feel like I'm speaking on that part. But in terms of our interaction with him, I think that he connected with both me and Ken because we're both Chinatown kids. We both come from working class backgrounds and, we've been working artists, right? Struggling, trying to figure out how to do the work for the community, oftentimes sacrificing, things to be able to promote the works. And I think because of that, he felt a connection. I know in particular he felt really connected with Ken, offering a lot of support to him. But in terms of himself, I think the one takeaway that I feel like from him that I admire and wish that I could emulate in some ways was just his passion for the community and how much he loved it. Do you know what I mean? It's just, he lived and breathed it. And, everything about the community just excited him. And just this whole fascination with Asian American history and Asian American leaders and civil rights, whether that was, a comfortable space for him because he was masking something else or because of hurt or what, I don't know. But it was just evident that that's where his passion was in life, So
I think when he died, I think people were shocked because he had seemed so young. You see the pictures of him; he's like 70. He looked. You could have thought he was decades younger. And I think
like you said in the film, he felt like he could do this for another decade, another 15 years, and and he was fully committed to doing that as much as he could. Right? I mean, he really honestly thought that that's what he'd be doing. For the remaining days of his life is just to continue covering the community. And in terms of him being so open with us, I think again it's because why he gave us certain access. And opened up to us emotionally was because, I don't know, I like to think that he felt like there was a connection between the work that we do as documentary filmmakers and the work that he does or did, as a photographer, because we're trying to do the same thing. We have the same goals, right? Which is to really highlight the community and the people in the community, not just the celebrities, but the everyday workers and the everyday activists. And so I like to think that's why he trusted us so much, So.
I remember about 13 years ago, I was working in a federal agency and, they asked me, I asked them if I could do an AAPI month event. And if you've worked for the government, sure, go ahead, but there's no budget or anything like that. And I said, Corky should come, and then I asked him and he's like, sure, and he came with 5 photographs. 7 people came from my agency because they're not going to make anyone come. And I remember I bought these stands to put his photos, and he was so enthused, and he was just so into it. And once again, I couldn't offer him a cab there. He was carrying big photos. He had to take a cab back, and I was just like, I feel really bad about this. But he was totally not focused on that at all. Having those 7 people come and him talking to them. And then he's like, I got these easels. Thanks. I'm going to take them home. And he took the cab home all on his own dime. And of course, I'm thinking about this now in relation to his passion, because it just was, he was a gospel. He was spreading the gospel. He 7 people see it, that's worth it. And before he died, Abney, we were able to, a law firm, this is 7 years after that, a law firm said, do an AAPI program for us. And this was a very deep-pocketed law firm, and they're like, and how much would he want to get paid? And I put the phone down and said, they're going to pay him, and I think we learned a lesson out of that, which was to value our community. And also to say these artists need to get paid. So I went through their website really quick, and they had all these top 3 New York Times bestsellers, and I was like, I think they actually pay real money, and I talked to Corky. I said, they want to pay you. I was like, and he's like, what about 888? That's, a good number. And I was like, okay, but let's just ask for more. Okay, no, that's enough.
8.
Yeah. And, they paid him, at the end of the night, they're like, who needs a taxi ride home? Who wants a cab? We'll call black cabs for everybody. And I was like, oh, this is how we should treat people, and we were glad that we were able to do that. But that passion is hopefully something that comes through. And at this point, we'd love to open up the conversation. And if you've got any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Hands up.
My name is Jane Orendine. I'm Filipino, and I was very active during the martial law years in the Philippines in the 70s, and that's when I met Corky. I mean, he was amazing. He came to all our events and really supported us. Thank you.
Absolutely. Like as the 1965 Immigration Act slowly sort of made its way and the Asian population in New York became more diverse, Corky didn't sort of relent on that. He would look through and he would say, I'm going to go to the Cambodian one, the Nepali one. Like, he was on to these new ones. He was it was effortless, this sort of community-minded. It wasn't just Chinese. That was certainly where he started and he came from, but he was really focused on that Asian American community. Yeah. Yeah. Back there.
Hello. Thank you for hosting this event. My name is Kem Shi, I was a member of Army. And actually, thank you, Chris, for mentioning that event at the law firm. I'm several people in the room know Kwok Lee for a very long time. I met him first as a college student. Also, I guess we're the same generation. I'm at the same generation as Chris and Curtis, but I got to know him better over time because I guess our shared love for photography, me as a hobby and him as a photojournalist and beyond. And I was also at the law firm event where Chris moderated and saw Corky's photos. And we actually caught a ride home together as well that night. And he did
you benefited, all right?
Oh, yeah, because I helped him with the cleanup. And he was like, wow, I remember him telling me, like, wow, they actually pay for my ride home. That doesn't usually happen because they called the car and paid for the ride. So we had many conversations over the years, both throughout our journey home to Queens together. I live in Queens right now. And I guess, over the years, I got to know Corky well. And I think in terms of his photos, I think it's such an important part of Asian American history, and I think I'd be very interested to see what will be in the book and what will happen beyond, And as you know, everyone, it was a very tumultuous time, Asian American history, and so much of it remains to be told, I believe. And I think part of it because it's also, and also maybe why Corky wasn't recognized more during his lifetime was because he was also known for, those of us who got to know and known, he definitely had opinions, he definitely had political views, so to speak, and they may not always be seen as, always popular, so to speak. He was willing to criticize what he felt fit, whether online or sometimes otherwise, for those of us who follow that, so. And I guess when it comes to choosing up photos for the book, I was wondering what about one particular photo where it'll be in the book, that many people probably know about. And this was the photo of Yuri Kochiyama outside the Silver Palace picket. It's the one photo, because it was for the National Portrait Gallery several years ago, the Smithsonian. Asked Corky to submit one photo, and only one photo he could submit from his entire career up to that point. And he chose the photo of Yuri Kochiyama standing outside the picket by the when the Silver Palace workers walked locked out. I'm not sure how many people in this room know about the history, but it's a very important part of history that should not be lost. And because these are ongoing struggles now in Chinatown, Corky was very involved in the anti-gentrification struggle throughout Chinatown, as I mentioned, since the beginning. And so I want to see if any of the panelists, who knew Corky, want to say why he chose that one photo and how and what the history will be said during that time. How it'll be described during that time.
Okay. Curtis's documentary was about gentrification, and Corky was the voice of New York. So that's really where it started. But yeah.
I just want to add that there's all this interest in Corky's life and his work, and we've gotten there's somebody who wants to write a kid's book about Corky with photographs and drawings about his life. And there are other educators who are doing Corky projects with fourth graders. I mean, we've put some of this on the website, so on the blog you can see some of these activities that are going on. And so I think that I find it really interesting that there are these young kids who are writing songs and performing them about Corky Lee, about how he helped them understand our history. He helped them understand about the railroad, because that's the leitmotif. And these are fourth graders, fifth graders, and so there's a whole new generation of young people, and there's somebody else who wants to write a biography. So I think ours will be the big book, but there'll be other books, and that's the more the better, I think, so people can learn about him and his work. Yeah. So go to the website. It's corkylee.org, and you can sign up to be on the mailing list, and then there's a newsletter every month, and you'll get the newsletter with updates about activities that are going on. So
Yeah. That person has a question.
We've got a question. Thanks, James. Okay, we got a question up here. Thanks.
It's not a question. I think that we'd be remiss if we did not recognize Corky's military background, and that he was a commander of the Kim Lao troop. I had the pleasure of knowing him. Every Memorial Day, the troop would be out in front of the memorial, Kim Lao Memorial in Chinatown, to honor the Chinese Americans who died in war. He was also active, very active, going down to Washington, D.C. To get Congress to pass the Congressional Gold Medal recognition of Chinese Americans, there are 25,000, who served in World War II.
Yeah, his father was the veterans. He was serving in the commander as son of the veterans. So it's just to be clear, his father was a veteran.
Well, my father received his gold medal, so I appreciate Corky's efforts in that. So his military background is something that should be recognized and applauded.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, I would definitely say that that's why we included that segment, because we had several things that we could have chosen from, because we filmed them in different places, but we wanted that one in because we knew how much the Kim Lao was to him.
That was one of his sort of last 2 or 3 projects that he really worked on, which was something that came out of an organization called the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, which he helped reform the New York chapter, one of the oldest Chinese American organizations in the country. So,
yeah. Also, the other thing I'd note is that when deciding what would be the last picture to focus on, we chose the spike, because the promontory point, because it's kind of full circle, because he talks about in other ways, he talked about like how that was the photograph that inspired him to do the work that he does, right? Like seeing that photograph as a child, and then not, seeing any Chinese Americans in it. And then we just thought that would be the nice way to part the film, was because, that sort of, for us, represented Corky and the activism that he did.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, he considered that photograph his piece de resistance. Mm-hmm. That was his most important photograph, in his view, that he took. Yes.
That's right.
Hi. Thank you so much for hosting for this amazing film. I was brought to this event by my 19-year-old daughter, and I'm ashamed to say that I'd never known about Corky before, so I'm very glad that she brought me to this event. What I find very interesting is how he felt unrecognized, underappreciated, yet we're all here. His legacy lives on. And how you guys, having been witness to his life and known him, and his path, like how do you account for that discrepancy between how he felt and then the recognition that he actually has? And as a larger lesson for Asian Americans who are very self-effacing and very counter towards the prevalent culture of self-promotion, how do you balance that so that you feel like you're making a difference and that your work and your name is getting out there and you're properly recognized for that? If you have any lessons learned based on your extensive, experience and your lifetimes.
When Corky said he wasn't recognized, he didn't mean that we didn't recognize him. He's beloved in the community and in the Asian American movement. And he knew that we loved him. He was talking about the mainstream media. And that is a complicated thing because, and he was very clear-eyed about that. He knew that there were the editorial gatekeepers. He would argue with editors about they need to cover Asian American events when they would turn away his photographs. And so I think that, it's not that he wanted fame, from the powers that be, but it hurts, right? It is a measure of our community's lack of recognition, right? It's a measure of our invisibility in mainstream America. So I think that when he talked about not being recognized, it was in that context, because I think he did know that he was dearly beloved in the community. And he, what we kind of saw through his photographs over time is that, in the 70s, especially when he was taking these, police brutality photos and a lot of action shots, he actually became, over time, less invested in photojournalism per se and more interested in intentional compositions that would educate people. And those were not taken for the Daily News or the New York Post or the New York Times. Those were taken for educating people, for your event.
Yeah.
Right? He would go, I heard a story about one of Potri Manas, who's a Filipina dancer and was very close to Corky. And her daughter was a college student at SUNY Purchase. Corky took the bus up to Purchase carrying 25, 30 exhibition photos and all his equipment. He took the bus up there and he put all the pictures in a circle and he gave them a lesson in Asian American history. And there was no honorarium. He did it for this colleague's daughter, right, who wanted more Asian American studies. So over time, I think he became, as an artist, actually less interested in, like getting the shot, right? Like the photojournalists want to get the shot, right, the action shot. He still did some of that, but he became more and more interested in intentional compositions. And his compositions are actually very interesting. Some of them are really quite wry.
Yes.
They're like, he loved to take pictures of Asian Americans in ethnic costumes, but waving an American flag. Or we have it's one of my favorite pictures of Muslim schoolgirls in front of McDonald's. And Corky said, it's the M's.
Right. Or
you wouldn't have gotten that, except that he told you, right?
Or that Chinese cabbie holding the Greek cup of coffee, which is slowly not becoming a sign of New York, but for a certain era of New Yorkers it is, in an old yellow cab, which you don't see anymore, but also a female Chinese American woman. Like, that's the dissonance he wanted to sort of bring.
Yeah.
And, his composition, in one of the rallies, that there's a picture of the SHSAT rally, that I helped together, and he was there, and he was photographing, and he had his camera down, he was just watching people, and so I cited up to him, what are you looking at, right? And he's like, I'm looking for signs. I'm looking for the ones that are handmade. Because the ones that, you get, because, I don't make any signs, I don't have that at home, but, the ones you pick up, but he's like, I'm looking for the people that made it. And that was the Shazat. And during the COVID-19, when he passed and all those rallies on the streets, I remember I was there and I was watching the rally, and every single sign was handmade. And I thought, he gave me that eye. He gave us that eye. And that showed me about what was going through people's hearts, because they were like, I'm going to make this sign at home. You know, no one's going to have a sign for me here. And that moment has come and gone a little bit, but I think that's an important moment in Asian American history, as important as the first one in the 70s. So, but Curtis, any last words? I think we're about sort of coming to a close.
Yeah, I was going to just respond to that question of, Corky feeling appreciated or not. I think that he was probably experiencing a lot of feelings that what artists feel, like particularly ones who work in different communities. On one hand, yes, you do feel the love from people because people, smile when they see you and whatnot. But then there's, at the same time, it's the struggle of being an artist, right? Like, are you being compensated?
Right.
And is it enough just to get that warmth of love and feeling, or is it also important for you to be able to pay the bills and stuff like that? And so it is a struggle for a lot of artists, right? Like thinking, okay, I'm going to do all this stuff because I think it's important. I get a lot of personal satisfaction from doing it. But at the same time, I'm not able to afford X, Y, and Z but doing it, but I'm still going to do it because I love it. So it's like the struggle, I think, that artists go through. And I do think that, and that's why he did bring it up several times with us, just this idea of compensation. Not that he was doing it for the compensation, because he clearly would do it even if he wasn't paid. But yeah, it would be nice to be paid as an artist. You know what I mean? It would be nice to have someone offer you money for something. And in a lot of cases, Corky would probably even turn down that money, right? Because especially if he knew it was a small nonprofit and they didn't have the budget. But I think it's just that idea of being offered the money sometimes is very important for artists to feel like we are recognized at that level. And so I do feel like at that, so it's like a weird tension. I'd like to say is that, yeah, he did feel like he was loved, but at the same time, I think that he might have liked a little bit more stability in his life in that sense of that.
Yeah.
I don't.
I want to make a comment. In regards to the last person who asked the question, this is how I see it. Corky, with each passing decade, was getting recognition. Many elected officials were giving him proclamations. He was getting a lot of requests for exhibitions at many academic institutions. And so if Corky had not passed away, I believe that this decade that we're in now, you would have seen a quantitative and qualitative increase in the recognition of the importance of his work. When I ended up working, after I had calmed down from my early college years, I ended up working for Mayor David Dinkins, who was the first black mayor in New York City. And there were many times at that, when I was attending meetings within city government, I was the only Asian guy sitting in the room talking about things like money, allocation of resources, and things like that. And I asked myself the question: well, if I wasn't sitting here, who would speak up and speak on behalf of the Asian community? So, change happens slower than we would like. Okay. When you're young, you want change overnight. You want it next week. I want to change society, and if it doesn't happen, then I'm going to do something radical, to make people pay attention. So as you get older, then you start to think, oh, how can I make effective change? And then that was one of the reasons that I had gotten into electoral politics. But you recognize and acknowledge that change happens at a slower pace than you would like. In Corky's case, he was very, very serious about printing his own book. He was talking to several different parties, and I believe that had he not passed, something dramatic would have happened in terms of recognition for his work.
Yeah. Professor Knight, did you? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, he was unique, right?
Yeah.
And he was a chronicler of our history and our communities. And he was really unselfish. He worked day and night, often without compensation, and that was his commitment, and he never wavered in that commitment. He never wavered, and I think that's something we can all really learn from. It's very inspiring, that somebody lived their life according to their beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, if I could speak to that, he was many things in one. He was a photographer, he was a social activist, he was an organizer, he was a historian, and I always felt like, yes, he wanted to be sort of well-known in the mainstream because that was his life's mission, but he never had an ounce of sort of like bitterness about it. He had the confidence of an artist who knew that he had found what he was supposed to do, and he was doing it, and he knew that eventually everyone else would catch up. And that's kind of what I sort of assessed, sort of from watching him from the corners. But thank you very much to all our partners. Oh, Young.
So if I could just take this privilege because, first of all, thank you, Curtis, for making this film. Very powerful. And the reason I want to direct this question to you is because you're not here physically, so I won't get to ask you the question during the reception afterwards. So some people here might not know that you also made another great documentary called Vincent Who. And you being from Detroit, you're very knowledgeable about the murder of Vincent Chin. I'm not sure if you're aware, but one of the things that Corky wanted to do was to do a flash mob to go to Henderson, Nevada, to basically protest on the front lawn of Ronald Evans, who actually was the murderer of Vincent Chin, and he was never convicted of murder, but there was a civil lawsuit with, by now, what should be millions of dollars in interest that has never to date been collected. Do you have any comment on that potential flash mob that Corky wanted to do? Have you ever talked to him about it?
Yeah, I've talked to him about it. I mean, so the Vincent Chin case does have a important impact on my life because, I was 14 at the time. I mean, our family, we were friends. My uncle was his best man. And so when he was killed, it obviously, altered my life because up until then, I actually thought I would just, work in my family's Chinese restaurant. I was just going to inherit it because it was a restaurant founded by my great grandfather in 1940. And it was just a really popular restaurant. And I was perfectly content. But after Vincent, was murdered like that, I kept looking through the papers trying to find stories about, Vincent and his perspective or the Chinatowns, the impact on Chinatown, but I couldn't find any. But yet there were all these articles about the white auto workers and the struggles they were going with. And that's actually when I decided that I was going to try being a writer because of that case. The first thing I started doing was writing these letters to the editor, which none of which ever got published because I'm 14 years old and not a very good writer. But, so the case has always shaped my life. And then when my dad passed away, and I had to go back to Detroit and sell the restaurant, I was working in LA as a TV writer at the time. But after my dad died, I decided to make a film about the Vincent Chin case because, I just thought what would be a film that my dad would want me to make because because he and Vincent were friends again. And so the Vincent Chin case has always been pivotal to me in some ways in my life. And in terms of going to the flash mob, you could do that. I mean,
when I interviewed Corky, he had just come back from Henderson, Nevada, and I think it ended up him there with like two other people, very few. And
I know he's done it a few times. I mean, and I, for me personally, the killers are the killer. I mean, I feel like for me, I've tried to put my energies in my life to building up the community instead and figure out how can we better respond. Because if you think about what happened in 1980 when Vincent Chin was murdered, we really didn't get any justice, right? We didn't have any power to get the verdict that we wanted. We didn't have any capacity. And so what I've tried to do in my life is try to build up our community's capacity because the sense is that there will be another Vincent Chin, sadly. And so what are we going to do when that happens? And so, I just have always, tried to, focus on that as opposed to, going and protest these guys or this guy. And I said that to Corky, but he was still committed to it. But I'm not going to be one to tell
Corky felt the Vincent Chin case very personally. He said he was around the same age as I was, and when he went to the killer's home, he went to his home. He bought candles, but it's like 100 degrees outside, and he put sort of maybe not actual candles, but lit candles across his front house, and then his camera actually malfunctioned because it was so hot. So the only photo, he pulled out his iPhone, and he said, the only photos I could take were with my iPhone. So his camera malfunctioned, but it was so important that he go there and let
No, I know that he was committed to it, and any time that he was in the area, he would go there. Like anytime there was a conference in Las Vegas or Utah, he'd figure out a way to swing by. And, he was clearly passionate about it. For me, I just feel like,
all right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Professor Ngai. Thank you, Virgo. Thank you, all the partners.
Bye, Curtis.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.